Right, let's get started. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this SPDA presentation, May 2021 SUDBURY Prospectors Developers meeting. So today we got a presentation lined up by Magna Mining. And before we get started, let me just thank our sponsors. It's quite a big list already. We only started this about a couple months ago, but we've had an outpour of support from a lot of companies here from Ontario, local companies and others in Ontario. So just quickly, Jacob and Samuel Drilling, Transition Metals, Canada Minerals, which was of course one of the presenters this year, and then SBC Nickel, Exiro Minerals, which was the last presentation by Josh given just a month ago. First Mining Gold, Inventus, Noront, which was our February speakers, Wallbridge, and Noble Minerals. And yeah, so the sponsors help us put these meetings on, and what we're doing also with what we started in January is we're actually recording these presentations. So those of you who've missed some of the earlier talks, January, February, March, April talks, they're all up on, actually the January one is not yet, but it will be soon up on YouTube, the SUDBURY Prospectors YouTube channel, and it's also linked, you can find it also on LinkedIn. So all these presentations are up there. So yeah, thanks again for the sponsors that help us make this happen. And yeah, so today's just a few quick housekeeping items. We're just asking everybody to be muted, obviously, because of just to avoid any background noise. So the format is we're gonna have a presentation first, and then we'll do a bit of a Q&A afterwards. So please feel free to send us any questions at the bottom. There's a chat function, so you can send in your questions, and we'll address those with Marshall. So yeah, so let's introduce Magna has been up to recently a private exploration company focusing on the Shakespeare project, nickel copper PGM project here in the Sudbury area. And but they actually just went public, or they listed on TSX a week ago, and they've got a drill program underway. So it's exciting times for them. And we have Marshall Hall, who's their exploration manager, joining us today. So he will give us a good overview of the geology and all the work that's underway, and how they're reinterpreting the deposit and all the exploration potential that they're seeing on the property. And yeah, so Marshall is, like I say, exploration manager there. And he's got many years of experience of nickel copper PG exploration in Sudbury. Before joining Magna, he was at Wallbridge for quite a long time. So that's where I met him back in 2005. I just thought about that recently. 16 years ago is that already. But yeah, we've had a lot of fun years prospecting in Sudbury, and yeah, he's continuing that now with Magna. And having a lot of fun, a lot of success. So yeah, let's welcome Marshall, and yeah, thanks for joining us. Go ahead, Marshall. So yeah, if you want to share your screen, thanks for coming in and giving us a talk. I know you just left the drill rig not long ago, so
yeah. Well, is that sharing properly there, Attila?
What's that?
Is that sharing the title slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it. It's all good.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, with that, then thank you very much, Attila. Like you mentioned, one of my first summers, I was actually Attila's field assistant. So I was thinking about that when I was getting ready for this. It's been a long journey, but it's been a good one. And I want to thank you all for coming to my talk this evening about Magna mining and the Shakespeare deposit. Is this just the tip of the iceberg? And for joining me, and we'll go through a bit of a geological journey together this evening, and I hope you guys enjoy. So I'll get into a quick cautionary statement. I'm not going to read this. I think it's a little too late in the evening to read all of this, but the quick and dirty of this is that there are some forward-looking statements in this presentation. Basically what that means is that these are interpretations based on the best of our knowledge as it stands right now, and some of these things and ideas may or may not come to pass. I'm sure everyone is relatively familiar with these, and if you want, we can always read these afterwards. So as Attila mentioned, Magna Mining, we were founded in 2016. And our primary focus these days is on our Shakespeare project and our which has a 43-101 resource, the major permits in place for construction of a mine and mill at 4,500 tons per day. And that deposit was a past producer through toll milling from 2010 to 2012. We're also looking to bring things into production in the next little bit. But right now, things are primarily focused on exploration, both at our Shakespeare deposit, expanding on the resource, as well as expanding on our regional targets around the Shakespeare property itself. As Attila mentioned, we recently just started trading on May 11th on the Toronto Stock Exchange under the ticker of nickel copper, and we've currently raised $7 million with concurrent financing to fund our 2021 exploration programs. And with that, I'm going to dive into a little bit of the geology, and what we can see here is a big overview slide with a little bit of an inset for Sudbury. And the main takeaway to get from this slide is just the location of where Shakespeare is in relation to other major nickel copper sulphide deposits across northern Ontario. In Sudbury as well, is that they're all located along the contact of the Southern Superior contact of the Southern Superior provinces, I should say. And as you can see, it runs around here. We've got Voisey's Bay, Raglan, Thompson, Duluth, and Sudbury. And for whatever reason, all of the deposits are all dated at 1.85 billion. There seems to be that around that time, geologically, was prime time for forming copper nickel PGE deposits. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. And to give everyone a little bit of reference, we are located just to the southwest of Sudbury, Ontario. We've got a relatively large land package. It's 182 square kilometers. And we're just in the same neighborhood as some of the majors in the areas, such as Valet and Glencore, and we are butting up onto some of the Wallbridge claims on the west end as well. So getting into the actual geology, I'll spend a little bit of time on this, and the reason for this being is there's three main theories as to what the mineralization at Shakespeare is controlled by, and historically those have been. It's been related to the Agnew intrusion, the Nipissings themselves, which are these greenish, the Agnew is in the purple, or it's related to the Sudbury igneous complex, which we're also familiar with over in here. And before I dive into those theories kind of as their own and get into more of the nitty gritty on the deposit, I'll give a little bit of background context on the actual deposit. So as I mentioned previously, we're located at the junction between the Southern and the Superior province. And on this regional map, you can see here, basically everything in pink to the north is the Superior province, and the shades of orangey yellow with green intercalations is the Southern province. And those are primarily composed of the Huronian volcanics and the Huronian supergroup sediments. And then of course, it's overlain by the Pinokian gneisses. Whereas the Superior province is largely granites and gneisses to the north, with small little outliers of Huronian outliers as well too. And the important thing here is that both of those units are also being cross-cut by the Nipissing gabbros themselves. So to get into the three main ideas behind the mineralization at the Shakespeare deposit is, the three main regional ideas is from sort of a west to east is that we've got the Agnew Lake intrusion, which is one of the older theories as to how the mineralization at the Shakespeare deposit here came into be, is that it's related to that layered magmatic system. But mapping by the OGS and mapping by past workers, as well as an age date that was completed in 2005, I believe, by Ursa Major, suggests that this is actually controlled by the Nipissing gabbros themselves. So when we look at the Nipissing gabbro within the area around the Shakespeare intrusion, you can see that it forms this little jogged formation in there. And what that is this is the mapped outline of the Porter Lake synclinorium. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what a synclinorium is, it is basically a fold interference pattern that happens when you fold rocks one way and then you fold them another way. And the synclinorium basically forms a basin like what we would see here. So when you trace the green unit, the Nipissing units around in here, that's basically forming that synclinorium. Which within our land package becomes relatively important because this Nipissing unit controls mineralization in the parasitic fold hinge where the Shakespeare deposit is, and then it also controls the P4 target, which has minor amounts of mineralization, as well as 2 high conductance EM plates. That's one of our regional exploration targets. But also further north, we have our Hanover showing, which also has high conductance EM plates, which is a regional exploration target. And we've also got the low sulfide high PGE system, which composes the Palladium Valley system, which runs through a topographic low up in here. This is another one of our regional exploration targets, mainly because at trenches like the BT trenches or the Brun-Turcotte trenches, we actually have palladium values of over 10 grams per ton palladium, not including platinum and gold included in those. So it's a relatively exciting area to be working in. And it explains part of the reason why there's so much more potential for further mineralization and further development on this property, because as I mentioned, it's 182 square kilometers and there's no shortage of regional targets in and along in there. And as I mentioned, this fold structure over at the Shakespeare deposit itself. And so let's get into what the Shakespeare deposit itself looks like as it stands right now. And so as it stands right now, the deposit is over 1.7 kilometers strike length. And the deposit itself reaches down to depths at the eastern portion of about 500 meters. And to give you some scale, what we're looking at in this image here is this is the lower pit and the upper pit, which corresponds to these 2 stars on this cross section that we're looking at here. So as you can see, without doing any further exploration, the mine workings and the infrastructure that's been implemented already is just the tip of the iceberg as far as the exploration potential for this deposit actually sits like and looks like. So we've talked about the resource itself a little bit. This is the mineralization look like. There's a few main styles of mineralization we see at the deposit. Primarily, the main one is the blebby to globular style mineralization, and that is the disseminated mineralization. And I hope this shows up on your screens, because this disseminated mineralization on this slide is actually accounting for about 15% sulfides, 10 to 15% sulfides. So it's relatively robust, intercalated in amongst the dominant mineralogy of the rocks themselves. We also have more massive sulfides where we get into that 15 to 20%. We'll develop net textured sulfides. And when there's a structural overprint on the deposit, we'll also get into some structurally connected sulfides, which typically happens in the blebby to globular and sometimes in the disseminated mineralization. There's also minor amounts of sulfide veinlets. And there's also a series of remobilized sulfides, which is typically associated with quartz veining that cross-cuts across the deposit. We can see these within the heart of the deposit. We also see these within the footwall, and pretty much anywhere you have quartz veining near the deposit, there's a chance for seeing some of this remobilized sulfides. And so the main host rock for the mineralization is that of the Melagabbros, which were originally identified or coined Melagabbro by Ursa Major back in the early days of their exploration. It's typically a fine to medium grained rock. It's the most common host rock of the mineralization at the deposit, reaching up to 15 to 20% sulfides. And the matrix in the mineralogy is typically dominated by amphiboles and pyroxenes. And there is another phase of the Melagabbro, and that is the fragmental phase. And as you can see here with some of these chalk outlines, is that there is a number of rock fragments scattered throughout in here. And these rock fragments can be anything from the overlying sediments. It can be the lower gabbro. It can be the quartz diorite units that are overlying them. And I'll talk about those in a second as far as the stratigraphy goes. But the key takeaway from this is that this fragmental system does contain fragments of most of the other country rocks that we've seen across the deposit. And it's all within this mineralized system. So if we get into the discovery and the Shakespeare resource as it's grown through time, it was discovered, or the first occurrence of it was noted in the 1920s by the Shakespeare Copper Syndicate, and they trenched what is now the West deposit. So where those two pits were in that aerial photo I showed. And it really didn't see a lot of exploration until the discovery of the Eastern resource by Ursa Major back in 2002. And after making that discovery, they invested a lot of time and money into drilling the Eastern resource and minor amount in the Western resource. And they really ramped the project up from discovery into production in just under 10 years. So from 2002 to 2010, they managed to get through all the stages of the mine life and get this thing up into production. They produced for 2 years, and then the toll milling agreements were done up, and the metal prices of 2008 meant that basically the product was, or not the product, but the production was no longer economic with current metal prices. Wellgreen acquired it in 2020. They did a little bit of drilling, but basically the property sat dormant after that production until Magna acquired it in 2017. We looked at the resource, updated it, drilled it in 2018, added to the resource, and now we've completed some geophysics and we're drilling, and we're hoping that with our drilling, we can continue this trend of where there's drilling, we can add on to that resource. So that's kind of the objectives of what we're looking at these days with the current drill program we have going. So get a little bit into that geological model I had mentioned earlier. And this is this layer cake model that was produced by Ursa Major back in the early days was very effective at defining the Eastern resource and chasing the resource to depth. They broke it down into two main units, which was the upper unit, which is the biotite quartz diorite, quartz gabbro, and the Melagabbros, and then the lower units, which is basically anything that looked like a typical Nipissing gabbro with minor amounts of peroxenite, and it went on in from there. And what you find as you go through the stratigraphy is you have a brecciated zone where you get quartzite fragments within this biotite quartz diorite, not always biotite bearing. And then you do get minor fragments as you get down into the quartz gabbro unit. Then you get into the Melagabbro, which may or may not have fragments in it. And as I mentioned, those fragments are of all of these other rock types that we're seeing here, including that of the Nipissing down below, the quartz gabbro, the biotite quartz, the biotite quartz diorite, as well as some fragments of the sediments themselves. So by using this model, the Ursa Major was able to create a 2006 resource that was around 14 million tons. They were able to take that into production and get that going. But where this model seemed to start to gain some difficulties was that in the West pit. With the brecciation that you can see in some of this drill core here, you can see there's a brecciation that overprints and cuts through all of those rock units that were just mentioned in that stratigraphy. And we can see that occurs in drill core. It may or may not be mineralized within the matrix. So we can see here, this has got some fragments of mineralized gabbroic rock. And then as well down in here, there's some mineralized gabbroic fragments, and there's minor amounts of sulfide, but most of the matrix in this system is barren. And then as you can see on the surface trenching, which is actually right up in here in an area referred to as the gap zone, we also have these larger fragments within this brecciated unit that complicates the geology. So when Magna acquired the property, one of the first things that was looked at was where's there room for potential and how can we change the model to show that there is more room for resources to be added to the deposit. And the first thing that was done was we completed a whole bunch of borehole EM. And as you can see in the blue here, we've shown that there's a number of conductive plates that we identified in 2018. And as I mentioned, in 2018, we also completed just over 3,000 meters of drilling. I think it was around 3,700 meters. And we took the resource from this and we intersected mineralization in all of the areas where we drilled EM plates, and we converted the resource into something that looks a lot more like this. So with that, we started looking at the geological model. We started looking at these breccias, and this is where we started to come up with the idea of the mega breccia system surrounding the deposit, and thinking that we would actually be able to start drilling, or not start drilling, but to connect these zones in here and then tap into around the S13 zone, which we also developed over in here as well from reevaluating the old historic drilling data. So when we look at this and we actually start looking at the rocks and trying to unravel what this means for where is there more potential from the deposit and how can we expand on this, we looked at the fact that there's electromagnetically open EM plates at depth that are not cut off, and there is nothing drilled underneath this area to cut this place off as well. So this is all relatively uncharted territory as far as the deposit goes. And when we look at the mineralization we see in some of the deeper holes, in particular this hole here, MMC 1807, we can see that we actually do start to intersect some relatively nice looking sulfides, particularly the fact that we're developing sulfide veinlets in the footwall of the deposit and at depth, where we're not really seeing these elsewhere in the deposit. Typically in the shallower levels, the most concentrated sulfides we see is that of the net textured sulfides. So as we get down with depth, we get into these sulfide veinlets, and we also get into these thicker zones of net textured sulfides, which are in the footwall of the resource and are not actually included in the current resource as it stands right now. So this zone in here is actually not included in the resource. So one of the other things we started doing with that to try to establish and figure out what's going on with some of this geology is we started looking at the whole geochemistry and looking at major element variations, which previously were not recorded for the deposit outside of Ian Dasty's thesis. And Ian Dasty's master's thesis corroborates these observations as well. And the main takeaway from this is that when we look at the Gabbroic section where we have relatively current sampling, we see a building MGO trend that comes down with depth and ends in a little bit of what's interpreted to be a Nipissing fragment. So there's a little bit of variation in the magnesium there, but in all the holes we drilled at depth, we see this increasing magnesium content which comes down at depth, which is very, very interesting, because as you can see in the drill hole trace here, this comes down, and this is actually building in the magnesium concentrations, the calcium and the chrome are all building towards the gravity anomaly, which we developed after reinterpreting gravity data that was collected in 2015. And furthering that with some of the work we completed in 2021 and 2020, the end of it, we completed some ground IP and some ground EM surveys. But one of the interesting things is that coincident with this and in this building trend, there is chargeability anomalies that seem to come in and corroborate what we're seeing with this gravity anomaly. So one of the ideas that's being passed around by the Magna team right now, and when we look at this, is that if we look at these building metal trends and we look at this development of thicker sulfides as we get further down in depth, is this idea of what if this gravity anomaly is actually in this building trend is actually indicative of something more massive that's down below the current detection limits of the geophysics and the drilling that's been completed already, and that we're not actually looking at something that couldn't be a larger feeder system for this brecciation and this Shakespeare style unit that's occurring through and coming up above into here, where we can see as well here that some of the higher nickel grades that we've seen at the deposit reaching almost 0.75% are coming from these anomalous zones further down at depth. And so then if we look at this in cross section over the course of the deposit, and keep in mind that this corridor is relatively thick and this thing's actually kind of plunging up into the resource, if we switch back to the cross section again, we are in the footwall of the deposit, and we're looking at a relatively thick slice through this, just for clarification when we're looking at this long section. Well, one of the ideas that we've been coming up with the idea of this mega breccia system is that we could feasibly be dealing with some sort of feeder system down at depth that's been previously unrecognized, that taps in, is coincident with the gravity anomaly, as well as the chargeability zones that were identified by the 2020 IP system. And in combining that with the geochem, we're seeing that there is actually evidence that we are building down towards, and we could be working with some sort of feeder system within this brecciated system as we're getting further down into depth and in and across the resource. So where does this leave us for what we're working with right now? Well, primarily the areas that we're interested in is we're looking at infilling the gap zone and stepping out on the western resource in the S13 and helping develop some more and gaining some more geological evidence to solidify our geological models over in the west deposit. But we're also looking at drilling some platform geophysics holes and some geology holes over in this area where there's the interpreted feeder system, so we can actually have some platforms for borehole EM and actually sit down and try to tap into what could potentially be further down at depth, which could be, as we have shown in here with this, based on this gravity anomaly and the charging and the building IP chargeability anomalies at depth, is that we could be working with something more massive at depth that is currently unknown and as of yet entirely untapped. And with that, that pretty much wraps up what I had for this discussion tonight. Are there any questions, comments that anybody would like to discuss?
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. That was a lot of fun. Thanks, that was awesome. Yeah, I mean, I have a series of questions here, so we can get into a bit of a Q&A session. But I'll encourage everybody to use the chat function there at the bottom to type in some questions. And there's already one coming here. So what are your chrome values as you're approaching the gravity anomaly? Can you talk to that, Marshall?
Typically, the chrome values we're seeing in the deposit range in the order of 2 to 300. As we get down in some of these holes with depth, we see that increasing into over the 400 ppm range, which is also unusual for Nipissing gabbros as well. The Shakespeare deposit has unusually high chrome values as far as Nipissings go. Yeah.
So yeah, talking about the suites. So one thing that I was wondering about is so you talked about it being a Nipissing intrusion or related to a Nipissing intrusion.
Yeah.
Previously, it was thought maybe it's part of the Eastbow Lake suite or Agnew Lake.
Yeah.
So can you maybe walk us through a little bit again the arguments and because one thing that I'm just wondering about, like, Nipissing isn't really known that much, you know, like there's not a lot of other cases of well-endowed mineralized, you know, economic Nipissing intrusives. So what would make this one so unique and special, or could it still maybe have some kind of relationship to the Agnew Lake, or you know, is there any thoughts on that?
Well, that's one of the interesting things about the Shakespeare Attila is it is very different from typical Nipissings, because if you try to, I can't think of any other Nipissing intrusion that hosts a deposit that has a global resource of over 20 million tons. I can't think of anything that has over maybe a couple million tons. One of the main arguments for why people and why it was interpreted as being part of the Nipissing suite is that back in the day when Ursa Major did an age date on it, and they sampled the quartz diorite, and the quartz diorite came back with an age of 2.2 billion years, which is right on par with that of the typical Nipissing suites. So with that, it kind of became ruled out that it wasn't part of the Agnew intrusion. And there's also people that make the argument based on the chemistry of those QD and the petrography and the appearance of it, that there was potential that the Shakespeare suite was actually related to the SIC. With that age date, people really, you know, it kind of pinned it down as being part of the Nipissing intrusions. But one of the things that that becomes interesting with this is that we know those quartz diorites are brecciated by those breccias that I was showing in some of those photographs. So it raises more questions than I can answer to your question, Attila, because it definitely becomes very interesting. And it's like, well, what is actually going on with that? the bulk of the mineralization is hosted in that Melagabbro. And although there is transitional contacts from that Melagabbro with the quartz diorite, there's also sections where you can see those quartz diorites as fragments within that Melagabbro. So as far as relative aging goes, it seems like that may be younger, but we need to do more concrete age dating, and I'd like to get a couple samples across the deposit and try to really pin that down.
Wondering if lithogeochem would help. We've got some experts here in the crowd, from what I can see. Mike Easton, Caroline, and people that are familiar with the area. So please feel free to chime in, or if you have any thoughts on the intrusion itself. The other thing that I'm wondering is, so you mentioned at the beginning the fold hinge, that the deposit is situated in that fold hinge. So
yeah,
what would be the relevance of that? Because I mean, it being if it's a primary magmatic nickel copper PGE deposit, what would the relevance of a fold hinge be?
Yeah, that's something that's been debated as well, Attila. And the answer is depends on sort of what theory you want to get into. And that's, was the Nipissing, was the intrusion in place prior or post folding, and how does that relate with some of the other things? There was a talk I gave last spring around this time as well, where I had looked at the plunge of the resource and I looked at the plunge of the fold hinge, and the two are almost identical to one another. So there seems to be at least a little bit of a structural control, at least as far as how the drilling outlines the resource. There does seem to be a correlation between that, at least as far as the structural control on the deposit. Whether that hinge has anything to do with the actual mineralization, that remains debatable, but there does seem to be at least a control as far as the plumbing conduit goes for the mineralization.
Mm-hmm. And kind of related to that, one thing I was wondering is, so you're pretty close, like you said, you're in the southern province, and you're pretty close to some of these orogenic effects, right? So you have some of these Pinokian and Mesetsal and whatever, and Grenville orogenies that are pretty active in that area. So do you see any overprint on the mineralization? And you've shown some of the photos there. There's some remobilized mineralization. So could that maybe, could these later orogenies have some effect on the mineralization? And
yeah, for sure. They certainly seem to in local areas. I'll use this photo as a bit of an example. There is a penetrative fabric that runs through the deposit and is basically elongated with the deposit, which basically this is following that fold hinge as it comes through. And there is a fabric that runs through, and it typically seems to be more concentrated towards the core, but it's not always at the core. So there's definitely been a structural overprint on the deposit, and locally you see that resulting in some interconnectivity in some of the sulfides, and essentially acting as not a pseudo high gradier, and not a high, almost acting as a little bit of a high grade to the system, but not quite a full high grade to the system, if you follow.
Because some photos, I mean, maybe it wasn't. It looked a little bit like almost the rock has a bit of a fabric, or there might have been some shearing. Not here, but some of the earlier photos, it looked like, here maybe.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm going too fast.
This one, I don't know. I mean, it might just be, but those sulfides seem to be sort of aligned along some fabric, right?
There definitely is a fabric that overprints and aligns those sulfides, for sure. There is.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now here's a question from Mark. If you could talk about the footwall mineralization a little bit, how does that style look like?
So some of the footwall style of mineralization, it becomes a little different than what we're seeing in this picture here. What that style looks like more commonly is more similar to this disseminated stuff, where there's a little bit less of an overprint on those rocks, and you're getting more of that disseminated cloudy style of mineralization. And where you get this rock, it sort of grades in and out of where it's mineralized, where it's not mineralized, and the context for where that where you leave that mineralization and where you remain in that mineralization is very diffusive. It's not, you can't draw a pencil boundary on it that just kind of dissipates out. The rock unit doesn't really seem to want to change. It's just, for whatever reason, that section doesn't have mineralization, but then you continue on further on and you'll pick up more of that mineralization a little bit further on.
And then do you see any metal zonations? So do you see some kind of like typical nickel copper PGE patterns where you get copper further away? And
there does seem to be in this style. There, from what we have right now, there seems to be more of a preference for it being more copper dominated with a little bit more elevated PGEs. For example, this style of mineralization is what we're seeing on surface, where we have the Birdsbane mineralization, which is an up dip of the eastern resource, and we're seeing this same style of mineralization up in there, where we have these disseminated pods, and over there we have almost 1% copper on surface, and almost between a gram and a half to 2 grams total precious metals. So there's a little bit of a preference for those elements in this style over the main bulk of what we see at the Shakespeare deposit.
Yeah, could you go back to maybe that plan view, just so we can visualize where that mineralization is?
Okay, for the Shakespeare deposit. Yes, yeah, so the birds.
No, like the plan view with the geology that you had, where you're showing those showings. So
yeah. So that is the Birdsbane's right here. It's just south of the deposit, and slightly it's south and up dip of the mineralization.
Okay. And you're showing some of those other purple stars, and I think at the beginning you were talking about some of those other showings. So I remember you guys found some PGE rich mineralization. Like, would some of that be there, or?
The geochemically, the whole rock rocks there's variation in the whole rock between what we're having up in here and what we have over at the Shakespeare, and then the Hanover seems to be a bit of a transition between the two. Typically, the biggest variation we see between what's over at the Shakespeare and what's over in Palladium Valley is the metal ratios and the metal tenors. The sulfides at Palladium Valley have much higher metal tenors, and the platinum palladium ratios are just absolutely, they're their own system compared to what we have over at the Shakespeare system. So whether that represents some sort of fractionation or some sort of shift in the magma as it comes through and falls around this basin structure to come up along Palladium Valley, or if this is a separate intrusion altogether, those are questions that we have yet to answer, and we're going to be looking at investigating at some point in the future.
Okay. Now there's a question here about the gravity area from Joel. You know, what's that potential immediate volume of this anomalous IP and gravity area? You know, sort of like surface area times meters of depth.
Oh, the gravity anomaly is quite big. It basically creates a nice big balloon that runs through along in here, and then there's extensions of the system which continue on and along and continue along further to the west of the deposit. I hesitate to put a number to what that could mean as far as tonnage goes. Because right now there's nothing testing these, so it's all just geofantasy.
So the gravity could, you're not sure whether it actually shows sulfides or whether it's the intrusion itself, or more. And like, what gravity is that actually? Is that like from the OGS some survey, or
no? So in 2015, Wellgreen flew a VTEM survey, and they also flew a Sanders gravity survey. So this is inversions created off those gravity surveys that were completed in 2015.
Okay. Yeah, the resolution of those gravities is always, wonder, like, does it see sort of a deposit-sized body, or is it more picking up, larger kilometer-sized?
Yeah, the spacing on those surveys, Attila, was it was 100-meter spacing. So I don't think I think we're looking at something a little bit higher resolution than a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer target.
Yeah.
With like the OGS style stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But what the exact nature of that is yet, we don't fully know. I suspect that it's probably something comparable to what we have at the resource right now, as far as where those gravity systems are interpreted to be coming through.
And yeah, I'm wondering about yeah. So you mentioned you raised $7 million recently, and so maybe can you walk us through a little bit sort of the next year, like what do you guys foresee for? So you're drilling right now, and like how much are you planning to drill, and you know, are you planning a resource update, or what are sort of the next steps, milestones?
So some of those next steps, obviously, we're drilling right now. Some of those holes are going to end up being borehole EM platform holes, and help us guide down and see a little bit further into the footwall than what we've seen so far. And then, you know, hopefully we'll get some nice targets that we can refine the drill and keep going from there. Right now, we're planning a 9,000 meter drill program, so we're well underway into that. About 6,000 meters is what we're expecting to drill at the deposit itself right now, and then we're going to be drilling that remaining 3,000 on some of our satellite deposits. So that would be something, for example, like the P4 system, possibly over at the Hanover. And you know, if we were to encounter something phenomenal here, maybe those meters would be shifted around, but right now, the plan is to drill the 6,000 here, 3,000 on exploration, and eventually we do want to continue. We do want to do a resource estimate update, whether that'll be in 2021 or 2022. That's to be determined at this point. Some of the other things we may be doing this summer would include there's some possibility of some surface trenching, as well as getting some mapping done at some of the other projects around the property.
So the drilling that you're doing here, I would imagine that you're probably pushing your holes to test that gravity anomaly as well, right? So you're pushing to greater depth than what was tested so far?
That's the idea right now. We want to get into the footwall below the deposit. So if we look at the cross section again, we definitely want to make sure that we can get in and test into the areas up around in here. But we also want to make sure that we test the shallower regions up in here where there's potential to add tonnage at a shallower level, where it has more of an immediate impact on the economics of the deposit.
Yeah, sort of low-hanging fruit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned some of the other targets. Maybe you can talk a bit about that P4 in Hanover. I don't think you mentioned, is P4 one of those Palladium Valley showings? So
P4 is an interesting target. It's got a little bit of a history of exploration. It was originally picked up in 2006 or 2007. There's a big swamp that runs through here, and you can actually see the swamp over in here. And Ursa, back in the day, they were working over there, and they identified the same Melagabbroic rocks and the same breccia system that exists over at the Shakespeare deposit. So they did some trenching work over in there, and they discovered that there's actually little bits of mineralization in the system. Having done a little bit of groundwork around in here, what you see in this nipissing system that comes through here is that you do have the same repetition of rocks that are very similar to what's over at the Shakespeare, and those are plunging in underneath sedimentary cover rocks. And we have a series of EM plates that were identified by the BHEM survey in 2015 that are coincident with where you would expect to see those Shakespeare-style rocks projecting down at depth. So there's little bits of drilling in the area, nothing within a kilometer of the actual VTEM targets themselves. So we're pretty excited to get the rig out there and actually test these two EM plates and see what we're getting. They're relatively high conductance, and yeah, like I said, I'm excited to get a drill out there. some of the other targets are the Hanover. So Hanover, there's more blebby to disseminated style mineralization in surface trenching over in here, reaching up to around 0.3% copper with around 0.1% nickel and half a gram PGEs. And again, there is some EM plates that are associated with this mineralization. Historically, in the assessment records, there's discussions that there is pyrrhotite and chalcopyrite that are intersected at depth. In drilling, there's no assays associated with them, and there's very little information on them. So we're also excited to see what comes from those EM plates over in this area as well too, to see what we could be in, to see what the potential of these zones are outside of the overall footprint of the Shakespeare deposit, and see where we can expand and see if we can't find some satellite deposits as well.
Yeah, and I guess you can do some lithogeochem to confirm that those are the same type of intrusives as what's hosting the Shakespeare. Now, while you're on this image, like one question is so the gravity anomaly, where would that be located? I guess here in plan view, like, is that directly below the deposit, or is it?
So that is located just about in here. So it's also the one bullseye target of the gravity anomaly is also associated right here in that this interpreted hinge of the fold structure as it comes through in here.
Cool. And that gravity covers the whole property, or?
It covers most of it, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Ed has a question here, which I'm going to read. So you've indicated that the petrology of the rocks in the PV area is quite different from what you see in the Shakespeare intrusion or P4 area.
Yeah, the Palladium Valley.
The Palladium Valley, yeah. And that what you see there isn't typical Nipissing Gabbro. So is there any chance that a co-location of the Nipissing and the Shakespeare intrusion is just chance, and that the Shakespeare and Palladium Valley intrusions aren't Nipissing at all? Maybe in UAH they could help sort these things out.
Well, that's definitely one of the things that we want to investigate further and try to look into. Because one of the things I didn't mention about the Palladium Valley is that where we have these elevated palladium concentrations, is there's also a series of unusual brecciation that cuts through and seems to be at least spatially related to the mineralization. So typically where we see mineralization along the Palladium Valley trend, we have some of these breccias that occur along it. These breccias, as it stands right now, are poorly understood. I don't have a good pinpoint for what they could be. To me, they look like they're still related to the magmatic system. But they have been described as being similar to pseudotachelites, like Sudbury breccia. There have been others that have made arguments that where they occur in this system it's actually a phreatomagmatic reaction. So where those Nipissings were being intruded into the sediments, it was somewhat unconsolidated, and you've got some violent reactions occurring along in there. Which actually brings up a good point that I hadn't mentioned, is that the Palladium Valley, there's a big skarn system. So there's a big unit of Espanola formation that runs through along in here. And typically where you see the mineralization along the Palladium Valley structure as well too, there is some correlation with the Espanola formation and these gabbros and that brecciation along in through there. So in answer to your question, Ed, I wish I had a better answer, but we need to do more work before we can really figure that out.
Yeah, it looks like there's some master theses or PhDs that could be done here, I'm sure.
Yep.
I mean, I just can't help but think that the coincidence that other Nipissings aren't mineralized, but then this one is close to the Agno Lake intrusion and is well mineralized.
Yep.
Maybe there is some kind of a metal remobilization or something like that, or like we said, maybe the later orogenic processes have somehow helped upgrade the sulfides and enrich them.
Yep.
Yeah, lots of interesting questions there. Yeah, any other questions from the audience? Maybe you can also raise your hands if you'd like to, and we can unmute you. Yeah, if there's no other questions, I'm not sure, Marshall, is there any other things? I guess we can follow you on your website and announcements now that you're listed on the TSX. Well, I'm sure we'll see some press releases. Oh, Joel is raising his hands. Let's how do I do the unmute? Joel, I think. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure if I can.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you go.
There
Yeah.
we go.
Hey, thanks, Attila. And thanks for the presentation. It's great to see people working on Shakespeare again. Just to comment on what you said, Attila, you know, there's really good examples of mineralization in the Nipissings from Sault Ste. Marie all the way to Temagami, and from, you know, the Grenville front all the way up to, you know, to north of Sudbury on the east side. So certainly a lot of those. Janes Township has a lot of really good mineralization. The Casson Lake intrusion, which just happens to be, you know, inside of the provincial park now, was worked for quite a while and has very good mineralization, higher grade and more concentrated than Shakespeare, but not as much, obviously. But, you know, it's been identified for a long time that Shakespeare was a little different. It's a combination of you know, of the footwall type, the thickness, and obviously the heat containment of the intrusion, because it has more inclusions and assimilation of surrounding rocks than many of the others, and therefore, you know, it's bigger and has more. The mineralized zone's bigger, but certainly, you know, it is a Nipissing, and, you know, they are all you know, very capable of, you know, they have high background nickel value. They're relatively hot, relatively magnesian for the level that they come in, etc. So so it's not surprising that it is, and that it's a Nipissing, or where it is really. And Agnew is not particularly, it's actually not as well mineralized as Shakespeare, in fact. So but also, you know, there's lots of evidence at Shakespeare that it is that close to Sudbury. There are pseudotachelites which can be traced back, you know, all the way out to the other side of Agnew and all the way to East Bow Lake. So, I mean, it's the same way of looking at that entire Sudbury map and saying, why is there so much here? Well, part of the reason why Sudbury's there, right, is because where it hit and what was there originally. But also, this is the rift margin, right? And so, you know, there's a lot there. Just one more point, though, for that first slide, a little maybe over promotional, to put all of those deposits on there and then say they're all, you know, the same age, 18, whatever. You had Duluth on there. Yes, Raglan. You know, Sudbury is an impact site, and all the rocks that it hit are older than that. So, you know, they are all circum-superior, but certainly not all the same age.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. That was really good insight. Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't want to poo-poo on the Nipissings, but yeah, I wasn't aware of a lot of other mineralized instances. I know I mean, with Walridge, we did a prospect quite a few of the Nipissings, and like, we've always found some mineralized, you know, bloody mineralization, and some of it was quite PGE rich. The one occurrence, I think it's called Rathbun Lake, if I'm not mistaken. It's on the east shore of Lake Wanapitei. I think that was, at least historically, described as a Nipissing, and it's a really rich, PGE rich, fairly small from what I know, sulphide lens, but I'm not sure if that's still considered a Nipissing or not, because I know, I guess is it the Inventus?
Yeah,
guys,
Inventus is working on these days.
Looking at it and maybe thinking it's an offset dike, as I see it, an offset dike. But thanks again for the audience, and thanks, Marshall, for taking the time good luck, all the best with your drill program. As you were saying, it sounds like it's running well. They're getting good meters, so
Yeah,
keeping you busy.
okay.
So
They certainly are.
So we'll stay tuned with the press releases following your website and all that, and yeah, maybe we'll invite you back a year from now again to talk about your updated, much larger resource.
Perfect. I look forward to it. Thank you very much, Attila.
Yeah, thanks. Lots of thanks coming in here as well, and congratulations. So yeah, thanks, Marshall. And just for everybody's information, yeah, this is recorded, so we'll put this up online for whoever missed it, or if you want to share it with any contacts. This will be up online, this presentation, and we'll make sure to post it. All right, have a good night, and enjoy this beautiful weather. Bye.
Thank you very much, guys. Bye.
Just got here.